Welcome to the Aleutian World War II National Historic Area and the historic footprint of the U.S. Army Base Fort Schwatka and Battery 402. This site is located on the island of Unalaska, in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. During World War II, the Aleutians, home to the Anunga people for over 9,000 years, became a fiercely contested battleground of the Pacific. This 1,000-mile archipelago saw the first invasion of American soil since the War of 1812, a mass forced evacuation of American civilians, a 15-month air war, and one of the deadliest battles in the Pacific theater. Fort Schwatka was the center point for a ring of defense installations that were strategically placed to protect the Dutch Harbor Naval Operating Base from a sea-borne invasion fleet. Fort Meare's Army Base and Dutch Harbor Naval Operating Base were built to counter Japanese and Soviet aggression in the Pacific and China prior to the war actually starting. But by the time Fort Schwatka was operational, the war had moved west and the threat of an attack at Dutch Harbor diminished. For the remainder of the war, this facility continued to provide navigational assistance to ships and aircraft entering the harbor. In 1996, Congress designated the Aleutians World War II National Historic Area to interpret, educate, and inspire present and future generations about the history of the Aleutian Islands and the defense of the United States in World War II. The site is a National Historic Landmark designated in 1985. Join us as we reflect on the history of this site and tour some highlights of Fort Schwatka. At 897 feet above sea level, Fort Schwatka is the highest coastal battery in the United States. Construction of Fort Schwatka started in 1940. The fort's cliffside location made construction challenging. Construction crews used a large engine to winch building materials up the slope. Remains of a sled can be seen today among the ruins of the fort. This sled hauled essentials to the fort, including 4 13-ton 155mm guns. By late summer of 1941, construction of a road eased the burden of transporting materials to Aleutians Head. In 1942, war arrived in the Aleutians. The Japanese attacked Dutch Harbor by air on June 3rd and 4th. Bombing of Dutch Harbor prompted an upgrade of the military base that was completed by early 1944. At full development, Fort Schwatka had over 100 structures supporting the estimated 250 soldiers stationed on this lonely mountain. Enlisted men's barracks. The soldiers of Fort Schwatka were on call constantly so that they could be summoned to their stations at a moment's notice. Soldiers were garrisoned on the mountain, which meant that they were separated not only from home and family, but also from their fellow military personnel in Dutch Harbor. Most of the soldiers lived in one of 4 large wooden barracks, which housed up to 63 people each. Today, the buildings have collapsed, but they withstood many years of harsh Aleutian storms. Enlisted Men's Recreation Center. Fort Schwatka's recreation center was essential to morale on the mountain. Today, the site of the recreation center is visible in the remains of a Quonset hut, a semicircular metal structure commonly used during World War II. There were a total of 54 Quonset huts at Fort Schwatka. Many were used as barracks for artillery crews. Looking down the valley on a clear day like today, you can see a road that travels to a cliff edge overlook. Along this route are ruins of warehouses, garages, and smaller barracks. You can also see the shadowy imprints of tunnels that were used to access command posts and the rotting remains of wooden staircases. These are structures that men used on wet and windy nights to reach their bunks. Cabana. We are now on the site of the last wooden building standing at Fort Schwatka, a now collapsed cabana that stood empty for over 60 years. Cabanas typically housed 4 officers and afforded more personal space and privacy than the open barracks. Officers also had their own latrines, recreation facilities, and club where alcohol was served. Electric poles are visible along the slope of Mount Ballyhoo. The entire fort relied on electricity to function. Lines were run from the power plant in Dutch Harbor. Water was also pumped up from the Dutch Harbor facilities and stored in tanks, which are no longer standing. The dispensary. Anyone in need of minor medical treatment on Fort Schwatka would visit the dispensary, which had a pharmacy on site and a few beds for patients. Larger hospital facilities were located in Dutch Harbor. Administration buildings. The buildings in the administrative center of Fort Schwatka have mostly vanished, but this area was once bustling with day-to-day operations. Storage and administration buildings and a small ammunition magazine were in this area. Other nearby ruins include the officers' quarters and the mess hall. Ammunition magazines. Fort Schwatka's munitions magazine structures were built of heavy-gauge corrugated steel and covered with soil. A turf-covered bunker embedded in the hillside was nearly invisible from the air. From this location, you can see the ruins of a machine shop and warehouse. Just across the road and down the slope was an electrical transformer and multiple Quonset hut barracks. Harbor Entrance Command Post. The Harbor Entrance Command Post was constructed in 1943, and it includes this embedded observation post. From here, soldiers would monitor vessels approaching the harbor entrance. This site was connected by tunnel to the elaborate underground command post, which was well fortified with heavy wooden blast doors. The command post housed a radar, plotting and intelligence rooms, and chemical warfare service equipment. It was entirely self-sufficient, with its own power, ventilation, and plumbing. Just south of the command post, along the road, was an underground radio communication station. Battery Command and Base End Station. Ulakta Head's Battery 402 complex was completed in January of 1944. This building was one of the battery's base end stations. On the upper level, the battery commander would coordinate operations including target acquisition, targeting priority, ammunition type, and firing orders. During World War II, this room was flanked by a state-of-the-art radar room. A tunnel connected the base station to the command post. On the lower level of this building, spotters would train an azimuth scope on a target and feed information to the engineers in the plotting room. Spotters from multiple stations would triangulate on the target, obtain its range, and then telephone these coordinates to the gun battery station's plotting room. Panama mounts. The original gun emplacements of Fort Schwatka, 4 155mm guns, were installed in the summer of 1941. This circular concrete structure is one of the original Panama mounts on Ulakta Head. Panama mounts got their name because this design was used for defense of the Panama Canal. The 155mm guns were a holdover from World War I. The barrels were 18 feet long and each gun weighed nearly 13 tons. From Ulakta Head, they could fire a 95-pound projectile 12.5 miles. Each gun had an 18-person crew. 8-inch gun platform. By late 1943, the 155mm guns had been replaced by 2 8-inch guns. Each one was 30 feet long and weighed over 51 tons. They could fire a 240-pound shell up to 22 miles, dwarfing the range and the power of the guns that they replaced. These were the largest caliber weapons in Dutch Harbor's Iron Ring defense. Each gun had a 25-person crew. The guns had a short life. They were destroyed by explosives in August of 1946. Only small pieces of these huge guns remain today. Battery 402. The horseshoe design of Battery 402's magazine complex allowed crews to provide ammunition to both of the 8-inch guns. Using carts, shells were wheeled through the blast doors to the gun positions at the end of each roadway. Before radars were installed, if an unidentified ship came into range during darkness, searchlights would illuminate it, and the spotters in the base end stations could then track the target. A Quonset room and interior latrine provided quarters for the gun crews. Diesel generators supplied backup electricity to the entire battery, including the guns and searchlights. Base End Station. At the far end of Aleutians Head is the second base end station. Data from both of Fort Schwatka's base end stations was needed in order for engineers to triangulate on the target and calculated speed. Today, this site offers a sweeping view of Aleutians Bay and is a good vantage point to watch vessels come and go in the nation's top fishing port. Taking a closer look, you can make out several other locations on the Iron Ring that strategically protected Dutch Harbor during World War II. Eider Point with its Fort Leonard, across Aleutians Bay to Summer Bay's Fort Brumback, and beyond Summer Bay to Constantine Point in the northeast. Fort Schwatka was a crucial outpost in the center of this ring. By 1948, Fort Schwatka was largely abandoned, and in 1950, the Coast Artillery was eliminated as a branch of Army. After World War II, increased use of aircraft in the military and radical new forms of weaponry made these structures obsolete. Fixed coastal defense forts are now part of a bygone era. The engineers who designed Fort Schwatka intended to create a fort that could withstand bomb blast, earthquakes, and gale force winds, and they were successful. Today, Fort Schwatka's gun mounts and lookouts are among the most intact in the entire country, and they tell the story of a unique chapter of military history in this remote corner of the United States.